Hola, de nuevo no vamos a disfrutar de
Hello,
un espectáculo.
everybody.
Creo
Now we're
que
not going to
también lo ha
enjoy
contado y
a
lo ha dicho también
show.
Noah, ¿no? Y
This
este
is what
espacio de las
Noah was
Trobades y Space
saying as well.
Mediterráneos
This
Albert Camus siempre
space
han
for
buscado ser
Trovadas
un espacio
Mediterráneas
no de
Albert Camus
entretenimiento, ¿no?
is
Sino un
not an
espacio de
entertainment.
reflexión crítica y
This
de
is rather
debate.
a
Y
space for
seguimos entonces
reflection,
ahora
for
con
critical
Franck
debate.
Planeille,
And
que
now we're
conforma
going
estos
to
invitados nuestros que son nuestra
start
familia
with to
camusiana,
proceed with
nuestros especialistas que
Franck
nos hacen
Planeille,
adentrarnos
who
en la obra y
is
en la
one of the
vida de Albert
specialists
Camus,
who
y
allows
Franck nos
us
va a
to go a bit more in
permitir
depth in the
comprender
life
mejor
and work
cómo
of Albert
Camus
Camus.
ha
And
ido
he's going
pasando
to
a través de
help
su
us
obra escrita de ese
know
monólogo a
how
ese
Camus
diálogo.
was
Doy la
moving
bienvenida
from
a Franck.
monologue
Muchas
to
gracias.
dialogue. Franck Planeille, you're welcome.
Pues buenos días o buenas tardes a todos.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am so happy to be here, and I would like to thank Miguel Moratinos, Sada, all the friends, Carlos, all the friends, because we're talking here about friends. I would like to thank you for this Trobades. I'm not going to speak Spanish throughout the entire conference, but I just wanted to say a few words in Spanish to thank you all. This is a place where you can bring new thoughts, because as Sandra was saying yesterday, here we have a kind of political engagement in the broader sense of the word. Let me proceed in French. No, I'm going back to Spanish. No, in French, sorry. Okay, so I would like to propose something that is a little bit off-road. Because, well, I know that it is difficult to take the floor after this amazing morning, but I would like to suggest that we can, I don't know, walk along the way together. And I would like to insist in musicality. I found a sentence by Michel Guinavert, who said in one of the texts, correspondence with Camus, he said, Camus is not the creator of the world, he is the creator of a music, or rather, he is the creator of a tone. And through this tone, he dares to say to the man what is obvious. There is no life without dialogue, there's no life without persuasion. I would like to begin with to return to this formula, which comes from a text that we have been talking about. It's a conference entitled The Witness of Freedom. It's a text from which these quotations are extracted, and this text condenses in a way all the thematic of the commitment of the artist. And what's interesting here is the link between the profession of an artist and the commitment. We know that in the 50s, this notion of commitment was very important. There was a reflection as well, a reflexive dimension, thinking about oneself. And this will be constant in all the work by Camus. The text called The Witness of Freedom was published in 1948, and it was also published in Actuel in 1950, a year before the publication of The Rebel. And this is important. And 1 year and a half Sorry, the speaker says this text was pronounced a year and a half after the plague. So 1948 is an important date in the work of Camus because it was the beginning of the Cold War in Europe, and it was also a moment in which Camus was publishing a series of articles called Neither Victims Nor Executioners. And these articles brought to polemic with an Orthodox communist. And 1948 was also the date for the state of siege. And actually, there is a misadventure in this regard. And we will see that there's an article addressing this topic and about the state of siege in Spain. So this is the time where these quotations are found. There is no life without dialogue. There's no life without persuasion. And at this moment, the polemic is very intense. And the production with Camus is very rich at that time. So the matter with commitment is a matter related to violence. And one can see that what's at stake is art. And Camus says that it is not the fight that makes us artists, but the art that compels us to be fighters. This is an essential point in the way Camus thinks, and this makes us think that, well, the artist does not fight from or with political, religious, or moral references that are external, but he rather fights from his art. But also, well, saying this may remain a mystery for all of us. And there is a mystery in this. Once we conceive the side of this mystery from which the artist speaks, well, then we try to access this side. It's, otherwise it would only be affirmations to which we would bring belief. So what makes the words of Camus not being imposed to ourselves? What makes them do not force us to believe or to have an adhesion that is comparable to those that we would express in front of diverse beliefs? What is it that makes us question ourselves? What makes us be convinced that he is telling the truth, that he's saying the right thing, and that he has our assent at the same time as we feel that it is our own thought that is expanding and that is deepening while remaining free? I think that to do this, we must follow the wake of words. I always think caminante no hay camino, se hace camino al andar, by Machado. The first of these words that I would like you to consider is the word witness. We were talking the artist, witness of the freedom. So this artist attests that there is a freedom that he can say, that he can speak for, and that he can tell us all. But the idea of testimony, besides its dimension of commitment, because he says, j'atteste, so I assert. So I assert and I witness of the freedom. So there's this dimension of commitment, and this is consubstantial to the definition of the artist. Now we remember the first pages of Nos Atipaza. There is a time to live and a time to testify of living. And there is a time to create as well, which is less natural. It is enough for me to live with all my body and to testify with all my heart. To live tipaza, to testify, and the work of art will come afterwards. There is a freedom in that. The witness is above all the one who lives and tells first. Is the one who tells first. And Camusian work, nuances in its characters, the multiple reflections of this notion of witness, from the most silent or apparently the most banal up to Marceau or Clamence, who end up taking the reader as a witness. We understand also that the stake is that of the word, of the logos. I would propose maybe to think about this. The artist is the witness of the world and the beings, and this obliges him to a very sharp and a very fine look. And in this spirit, we could think about the notations in the notebooks, the anecdotes, the small true facts, the fleeting notations of situations, landscape, that enter then in vibration in the works of creation. For, as Camus never ceases to affirm, the artist distinguishes where the conqueror levels. Thus, the artist at work exercises an art of the listening, of a unity, which is the harmony of the contraries, but also dissonances, disagreements, and not a normalization or a leveling or a unification. To listen, to say better, and to say for all. The artist restores then, by his work, the quality of listening, which allows the work to emerge. And this is not a normalization or a leveling or a unification. Now you will see that through my discussion, well, there are lots of little places that I would like you to visit, such as a little place called Michel Vinavert. And this is interesting because in France, Michel Vinavert's correspondence with Camus was published. Vinavert met Camus in 1946 at the age of 19 years. And well, they're related. And Camus encourages him to write, and Vinavert was published by Gallimard. And Vinavert becomes then a theater author. And you would think that this has no relation to the topic, but actually, today, we will see that Vinavert would evolve to a theater that would be different from that of Camus. But then, Vinavert one day writes a very critical letter to Camus about Les Justes. And the answer by Camus is, "Thank you for your frankness, which touches me more than all the speeches that are made or written to me." So Camus will continue to support the work of Vinavert, even if he expresses the differences with his own conception of the theater. So one can see the quality of listening. Even that listening is widened with the disagreement by the other, the dissonance. So actually, now to relate this with the topic of musicality, I would like to give you to listen to some measures of the quartet of dissonances of Mozart. This is called the Dissonant Quartet. You will see that this is a series of quartets that were dedicated by Mozart. And before making you listen to this, I would like to say that when this work was published, musicians demanded to receive the work, and they came back to the publisher and they said, "Oh, look, this is unreadable." And the publisher said, "Well, this is what it is." And then another anecdote on this was that, well, this quarter would be played once to a prince, and the prince was enraged and he was all upset, and he said to the musicians, you're being dissonant, you're playing the wrong chords. And we show the play and to the prince, and then the prince tears all the papers and leaves. Actually, today we could listen to what was inaudible in the past. And actually, if you listen attentively to dissonance and to disagreement or to mischords, could be what actually animates what we can say about monologue and dialogue. Let's go.
Alors voilà, vraiment les premières mesures.
So these are the first measures only. This may seem to be off topic actually regarding from monologue to dialogue, but I think that we're actually just pointing at the very core of the topic. We could think, that the stranger or the plague are different dialogues between different characters, and that we could establish a typology of dialogues. But it's not that simple, because when you first read The Stranger, you cannot hear dissonances. There are remarkable. The work is remarkable, except for the scene with the chaplain. Meursault speaks, and in a way lets others speak without apparently listening to them, and his attention may be aroused. For even in the dog, it is always interesting to hear about oneself. Meursault remains attentive, not only to what he can hear, but also what can be interesting for him. So this would be our external reading. But Meursault can also understand the emotion and hear the emotion. He talks about, he spoke in a worried and urgent voice. I understood that he was moved and listened to him better. Meursault's attention is thus awakened on several occasions by the dissonance that appears in the other's monologue. The characters can thus be seen in the light of solitudes, each in a kind of personal recitative. I have to say that this would be caricatural, but this is a particular attention to the points, the meeting point of these different dissonances, and this somehow it's what moves from monologue to dialogue. Indeed, many moments are brought back to the figure that is quite important to me. It's a figure of banality. Actually, from the very first pages, Meursault says, after learning about the death of the mother, he says that I ate at Celeste's restaurant as usual. They were all very sorry for me, and Celeste said, we only have one moment, one mother. And actually, regarding banality, this scene seems exemplary to me. So it's the agreement of all, without any false notes, with the appearance of the obvious. It can only be said because it is considered as a banality, but literature, the effect of reading it, says that one can say that this opens the space of what is said in the scene. This banal scene, because of its very banality, speaks of modest compassion, a form of human brotherhood, a code of conduct so natural that they can only be described. This banality can only lead to silence. So, in between yes and no, the son is in front of his mother. By remaining silent, the situation becomes clearer. He is her son, she is his mother. She can say to him, you know, and there too there's a silence. But the monologue can express what we could call a dialogue in agreement. Most of the dialogues in The Stranger are meetings of monologues. Some of these monologues merge, some others don't. And actually, sometimes there's this merger. In other cases, there's a dissonance, there's a gap. And finally, other monologues are separated, isolated from each other. The points of connection with Meursault are then the dissonance, the perception of an emotion, of a contradiction, of countersaying, so with divergence. This figure of the monologue is an essential agreement in the expression of banality. But we should not omit another essential element, which is that of the relationship with the world. This sensuality is only expressed in small touches. And this sensuality finds a culminating expression again in the scene with the chaplain. You know, after Chaplin's departure, Meursault lets himself go on his bunk, and when he wakes up, he says, "Smells of night, earth, and sky refresh my temples. The wonderful peace of this sleeping summer entered me like a tide." It is then that he can open to the tender indifference of the world in consciousness. This rooting, conscious or not, is a determining element that states the agreement. The monologue, the figure of the monologue in The Stranger, that allows us to enter in the figure of agreement. And then the element of dissonance or disagreement appears in this scene with the chaplain, and it's the only moment where the narrator calls his reader as witness. At the moment when his anger bursts and he physically seizes the chaplain, I poured all the depth of my heart on him with mixed jumps of joy and anger. He looked so certain, didn't he? So we see Meursault's anger that is triggered by the chaplain's intention. And the chaplain says, "I'll pray for you." Now, this revolt sets a limit that must not be crossed. And the chaplain has crossed the limit without knowing it. But what is that limit? Here, we could even think that accepting without saying, accepting this chaplain's "I will pray for you," is for Meursault the fact of becoming the subject of a community to which he does not belong. He's accepting to be the subject of a power that he does not accept. He accepts the judgment or the ruling of justice, but he does not accept any other judgment. I had only been told that I was guilty. I was guilty. I paid. Nothing more could be asked for me. In a way, Meursault retains a freedom and signals another dimension of the theme of monologue, banality, and silence. And this is the constraint of lying. And this is in relationship with what we could call the abstract man, the displaced man, the uprooted man. There's no more landscape for this man, no more world. Just like the plague in the state of siege, the discourse of tyranny sets up the monologue as the only discourse. So you'll remember the passage of, or the excerpt of the plague, which says, "Silence, I will impose silence." So the despot is alone. Despot levels everything. Caligula is also the image of this solitude for all. As Helicon says with much good sense and prudence, he says, "I'm not his confidant, I am his spectator." It is wiser. And here there's a total reversal. Agreement becomes submission, banality the language for all, and the language of all. So today, for instance, we could see the work of Victor Klemperer's on the language of the Third Reich. So the agreement becomes submission, and banality becomes the language for all and of all, and silence becomes a universal rule. And it is here where we could find a kind of knot that the artist would give to its own time, and that would allow the artist to get involved, to commit, by remaining an artist as well. So the artist could commit from his own work, because the artist is able to feel the signs of a living community, and the artist can make the community feel its values when they're betrayed. So it becomes an instrument of tyranny and totalitarianism, because he is the only one who can do all that with a precise acuity. So we could say, in this regard, that Caligula has very well understood this. And the silence that reigns over the misunderstanding is the heart of the tragedy. It is the silence of solitude. Caligula's monologue orchestrates the variations and arias when it makes all the characters chant and dance, except for Helicon, who remains a spectator. But there's no other possible solution. He's a spectator, but by doing so, he's also an accomplice. There is no alternative. It's submission or being an accomplice. The impossible dialogue is born of the reversal of the fragile values of the granted monologue, where silence or power burst into the world. However, the same values, silence, banality, agreement, can find a regeneration in listening itself, not in listening to the powers of history, but rather listening to what is said of each person, even at the heart of tyranny. And in this regard, the plague can be crucial. And actually, it's the character of Rieux that we have in mind, because Rieux is able to listen with a very specific sense, because he's a doctor and he listens without judging, and he's a medical listener. He just hears, he understands, and he makes from this hearing what is made for fraternity. As one can guess, the link that unites the figures of the monologue and the dialogue are multiple and complex. In a certain sense, La Peste extends and amplifies the themes of the outsider. And actually, if we think about a text that was published before the plague, the Minotaur or the Halte of Oran, this is a text that comes right after the summer in Alger. And, well, the people of Oran in the Minotaur are not so different from the people of Alger. It's solitudes that live in a crowd. However, there are two important differences that we may note. The first one is that in Alger, we're talking about the city that opens up to the world and to the sea. However, Oran is not. Oran turns its back to the sea, despite the love of its inhabitants for the beaches, the sun, and the simple joys that bring them closer to the Algerians. This is some kind of spring that we sell in markets. And the second major difference is that of the history itself. And here I will go back to the plague. But in The Stranger, we're talking about an ordinary character who is at the center of an extraordinary event. In the plague, it is a whole city, a whole people that must face the extraordinary and conjugate what is the business of all and of everyone. And this multiplied the solitudes and monologues in as many characters. Each of those characters tries to pursue, within common misfortune, the monologue of their life, their own recitative. The asthmatic old man, the man with the cats, but everybody ends up stumbling on the circumstances, the nostalgia, the revolt, and little by little, however, each one enters in resonance with the others, but in its own way.
Faced with this multitude, the focal point in this narrator chronicle round whom the figures of the dialogue gravitate. The important thing is to do one's job, to live a requirement, which is neither imposed nor affirmed abstractly, but which is discovered, formulated, and affirmed in the course of the dialogues. For the combination of these three elements, the uprooting of the world, the extraordinary lived alone, is sometimes in solidarity. And there's a narrator character who could say about his job, as Camus said about that his job as an artist. He said that it was uncertain of being an artist, but sure of not being something else. And this can be generalized to many of the characters that will be involved or engaged in the plague. Uncertain of what they are, but sure of what they are not. I'd like to refer to two characters, Rambert and Panu. Rieu fights as he can, listening to others as well as to symptoms and signs, listening to everything that allows the doctor to heal. And he could, however, be taken by the abstraction itself. It's like Nietzsche saying, don't fix your eyes on the abyss, or the abyss will fix its eyes on you. And with regards to Camus, Francis Curel published a text with these resistance tickets that Char wrote. And Char wrote in the middle of the armed resistance, I want never to forget what I was forced to become. For how long? A monster of justice and intolerance. A cloistered simplifier, an arctic character who is uninterested in the fate of anyone who does not join him in slaughtering the dogs of hell. Of course, the circumstances are not the same. When Shah wrote this, he had weapons in his hands, in a daily contact with death. And he's talking about this right to slaughtering. And this brings us back to the revel. But what we retain here for our purpose is the end of the text by Char. This character who's indifferent towards other people's destiny, except for those who join him. Rieu only refuses this intolerance because he remains obstinately in the relative, in listening to discordance. Even if, as he marks it in his first interview with Rambert, he sets a requirement that he cannot transgress. He is doing a report on the state of health of the Arabs, and he suggests that he will probably not be able to tell the truth without reservation. And Rambert says, well, this famous phrase by Camus, the truth is said without concessions and is always difficult. So what is said clearly is a disagreement. But when, well, Rambert says when he's accompanied, he says, I think I understand you, and opens another space, which is that of a plan on which he could meet. Again, by reading, by the effect of reading, we perceive the difference between what it is said in the dialogue and what is said by the dialogue. Rambert says, I believe it, after a silence. Yes, I believe it in spite of myself and in spite of all that you have told me. So the idea is to make it possible to leave, and we will say that's the way it is. But there might be where we can meet, a place where we can meet, and that's where this reply comes from Rambert. I believe it, after a silence. Yes, I believe it in spite of myself and in spite of all that you have told me. He hesitates, but I cannot agree with you. And we find throughout the dialogue this reference to a disagreement. Listened to together, which does not proclaim a winner, but leaves each one with the freedom not to approve. Yes, there are disagreements, but by listening to them, to those disagreements, each one will listen to the reasons of the other and nourishes his own reflection. Thus, Rieu also meditates on Rambert's reasons. The journalist was right in his impatience for happiness, but was he right when he accused him? You live in the attraction. When the son of Judge Othon dies before Rieu and Paneloux, Rieu says to Paneloux, with violence, and that one at least was innocent, you know that. Paneloux joins him. And then the dialogue will develop between them, listening to their differences. And Paneloux says to Rieu, and yet I have not convinced you. And Rieu discerns their commonplace, their shared point. I don't know how this is going to be translated, but we have this commonplace, this lieu commun. And they are together to suffer and fight death and evil. And this poses a fraternity that is expressed by Rieu, saying, God himself cannot separate us. For me, there's this phrase has an incredible strength. Dialogue is never a game of dialectical confrontation of ideas, but a continued search for a common place, for a common ground in brotherhood at the level of man. It is also the first step towards persuasion, the most difficult to accomplish. However, how can we identify what makes this persuasion alive and true?
Persuader, est-ce que ça veut dire, serait-ce
Would
convaincre?
persuading mean
Mais convaincre, c'est venir
convincing?
le vaincre.
That is to say, to finally overcome the other,
Persuasion n'est pas victoire.
to win. Yet this persuasion is not victory.
Non pas ramener vers soi,
It does not consist in bringing back to oneself in the
persuader, ce n'est
dialogue
pas convaincre.
to a kind of abdication. To persuade is not to convince, but rather to join. I'm very proud of this phrase myself.
Il me semble que c'est là le silence.
It seems to me that
Et à ce moment-là, on revoit le silence apparaître.
silence reappears there again, playing an essential role.
De Tarou dans ses carnets.
We see by Tarou in the
On
notebooks
s'habitue à la vérité,
quotes,
aussi.
while quoting, it is at the moment of misfortune that one becomes accustomed to the truth, that is to say, to silence. And silence is always there throughout the plague, like so many suspended moments of common search of reflection and agreements. It plays a role that gives measure to a kind of rhythm of thought, but also of the reflected and free meeting.
Parce que je crois qu'on ne faut pas trop traîner.
Well, I'm going to try and speed up.
Que finalement, il a renoncé à partir et qu'il va se joindre à eux.
When Rambert tells Ria and Tarot that he has given up leaving the city and that he's staying with them, he expects a movement of joy or satisfaction. Nobody answered, and Rambert seemed to be impatient, and he questioned them to initiate some answers, but neither of them answered yes.
Ni l'un ni l'autre ne répondirent encore. Le silence dura longtemps.
The silence lasted for a long time until we approached the doctor's house. So that's the silence of agreement, of agreed beings, but which leave Rambert his freedom. Just as Ria had advised him some time before to hurry if he wanted to leave the city, there was no judgment of Rambert's decision and will. They leave him to his freedom. The silence that welcomes Rambert's decision can pass for indifference, whereas it is an affirmation of the will to keep everyone's freedom intact, always open. Exactly the opposite of what happens when we welcome someone with hurrahs in an embraggement. We can see here the fruitfulness of a reflection on the monologue and the dialogue. If one accepts the hypothesis according to which each being lives a kind of essential interior monologue, it is also necessary to listen to hear the dissonances and the assonances which surround it and touch it. This morning, I was thinking about this. If we listen to what happens around us, everything is dissonance, and we create it. Each morning, we don't meet artists every morning when we drinking a coffee. To listen in a specific way is just absurd. And I'm thinking about Mozart. To open oneself to the tender indifference of the world is perhaps also to open oneself to the song of the dissonances that make it. In a way, to be attached to dissonance, to the world is being attached to dissonance. The inner world, the conscious, the intimity, as many call it. The assonance in the stranger is expressed in the banality, but also sometimes in the insignificant. This is important for Camus. But our hypothesis is that the reversal of this chain of events, when silence is imposed, banality confiscated, monologue normed, the path to enslavement is already traced. It is the spring of all tyrannies, and it is thus at this crossroads that the artist is situated, and to which it is necessary to answer from his work.
the elements of human are used in the word in his work, and then the struggle can be that of the artist. So we can feed this kind of analysis with what can be found in the chapter Revolt and Art in the Rebel. And this is a summary of this Meridian thought. So we've got the meetings, the monologues, in a dialogue with all. I'd like to finish, and I'll be very quick now, with a point that is not always measured. And that is that there are two ways of apprehend this point. Either we study the genetics of the text, and this is not easy, or another option is possible, more rational, is reading an assiduous reading or a work we love. We know that works are not written in the chronology in which we read them, or in the chronology of the publishing dates. Well, we read the Stranger, the Plague, and many things happen in between. We could imagine that there are subterranean strata, underground strata. Well, there's one book that is being written, another one that is being the idea level, then there are some notes for a new one, and at the same time another one is published. And we have all these different levels with this capillarity with multiple vessels is both a danger and a richness. So it's a lot of merging, and perhaps that's the life of the artist. So the work of that is put into the creation of something that didn't exist before requires an extreme concentration. And this capillarity that is feeding the piece of work is going to make it circulate towards commitment of the artist and of man. And thus, one cannot detach from the work that we read, all that can be written at the same time as it is. But at the same time, there is perhaps to thinking which way the work that is written is also inscribed in the expression of the artist. I think of the controversy that opposed Camus to Dastier. He was writing The Plague at the time, but it was about night victim on executioner. And I'd like to finish saying that the worst thing that could happen to you would be to see a success of what you've tried to defend against me, because then you will be right in this world, but you will be wrong in the middle of silence. And it is a victory that I will never envy you. The theme of the monologue here, we have Camus leaving the door open to this potential common place where we can meet. And this theme of the monologue, of the dialogue, is the way of entry. It's where the artist can place himself in his work and from which he can truly commit. And in this sense, the Camusian thought is exemplary
by its requirement and demands, but also by this fraternity towards his reader, which leads him unceasingly back to the roots of our freedom and silence. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Franck. Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Franck. And now we are going to have our lunch break. So we will be back here at 4:30, here to continue our dialogue with images, and we need to solve the issues we have with the screen before that. So thank you for your patience, because of the current situation, we're a bit slow, but in any case, thank you, and see you back at 4:30.